This happened on New Year's. I was home alone for the holiday, having already spent Christmas with family, and didn't have anyone to go out with on New Year's night. So, I just kicked it back at home, had a couple beers, and watched TV the whole night. I watched the whole Times Square celebration, then just turned on some older holiday movies. I wasn't all that tired, and around 2 a.m., I felt like getting up and doing something, since I'd been sitting on the couch pretty much all day. I looked out the windows. It was snowing a bit, but not too much, and I knew it was cold and dark out there. But a walk just sounded really nice. I grabbed my jacket and hat and gloves, and headed out to walk around the neighborhood. Right away, I noticed it was surprisingly quiet outside. Even though it was 2 a.m., I figured because of New Year's, there would be parties and whatever. Yet, all the houses only had their outdoor Christmas lights on, and no cars were driving through the streets. It was simply quiet and deserted. Very peaceful, actually. I'm not even too sure how long I was out there for. Obviously, I wasn't fully sober, so time was hard to keep track of, and I was zigzagging through the neighborhood with no real direction or route in mind. I eventually arrived at the park. It looked like the path hadn't been shoveled since that morning, but it only looked like maybe 2 inches of snow, so I just started walking down it anyway. I thought the slight change in scenery would keep the walk interesting. I walked a little ways in before realizing that not only was the snow actually getting harder to walk through, but there also weren't any lights on along the path. I'd walked it at night before, and it always had these small sort of street lamps lining the trail, but I guess they turned them off for the winter. So I turned around again after a few minutes. After dragging my feet through the snow for about a minute on my way back, I noticed something rather strange. Just a few minutes ago, another set of tracks ran directly alongside mine. I had to have had someone walking directly behind me. And to be honest, it appeared as though they had been tracking me, since there had previously been no shoe prints there. However, I saw no one, and when I looked to see if they had turned around, or where they had gone, I discovered that the tracks led off the trail and into the dark places where I was unable to see anything. It was completely dark, so I wouldn't have known if someone was standing 10 feet ahead of me. Even though I was moving faster to get out of there, I wasn't entirely convinced that it was something to be too concerned about. I acknowledge that I might have been inebriated and failed to recognize the oddity and potential danger I was in, particularly with the tracks veering off the trail and heading directly into the shadows. I tried to think it was just a huge coincidence at the time. I left that place and continued walking around my neighborhood without going home just yet. I continued to walk for 15 minutes. I wasn't really searching, but since I didn't see anyone else, I assumed I was safe by that point. After returning home, I removed all of my winter clothing and decided to take a shower in the hopes of being sufficiently exhausted to go to bed. I didn't notice how dark it was or that the lights upstairs were off until I was halfway up the stairs. I was surprised by this, as I'm the type of person who keeps the lights on all day. Since getting up in the morning, I hadn't even gone upstairs. I did in fact leave the lights on up there. I understand that this might seem like a minor issue that I was obsessed with, but I believe that even if I had been completely inebriated, I would still have been aware that those lights were left on. I carefully ascended the final steps to the hallway and peered down, then turned the light back on. However, I had no idea what I was searching for. I strolled through and glanced into each room to see if there was anything clear. My heart stopped when I checked the final room and turned around because I made sure to close each door after looking. Right next to the stairs, the first door was ajar. That proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that someone was in my home at that moment. I froze for a few seconds before yelling, "Who is there?" I was afraid to move. They could have been anywhere at this point, either in that room or by sneaking downstairs. I recall moving quietly, slowly, and cautiously down the hallway. Feeling, as I got closer to the doorway, I felt both adrenaline and a terrible sinking feeling in my stomach. After that, I awoke. No, it wasn't all a dream. I awoke with a terrible migraine and my head spinning while lying on the floor in the middle of the hallway. It was clear that I had been attacked and rendered unconscious, with no memory of anything other than the moments preceding whatever the hell had happened. I believe it had only been 10 or so minutes since then. My vision was flickering in and out as well. I immediately dialed 911. The person who had broken in and assaulted me had long since left, but I attempted to provide the police with an accurate description of all I could recall. I still find it extremely annoying that a portion of my memory was completely erased. I probably had enough face-to-face interaction with the man to get a decent description of him. Hell, I may have even recognized the exact person. However, I feel as though my own mind is keeping it from me. There were few updates after that evening, and nothing ever resulted in anything noteworthy. I have no idea who it was or what his true motivations were, but if he didn't even want me to wake up, I wouldn't question it. I work at a nearby ski resort in a tiny mountain town for upkeep and security. My main responsibilities were cleaning and general maintenance, but I also received some security training because there had been several overnight break-ins where people tried to use the slopes while we were closed, or stole skiing and snowboarding equipment. Following a number of incidents, the company rearranged schedules so that 2 employees would work overnight to complete our regular tasks and deter potential trespassers. There were no cameras or anything. Therefore, once we started working, the security title of my job never really affected my day-to-day work, because for months, no one else attempted to break in overnight. It was always quiet, with the exception of someone approaching the door and attempting to look inside. Furthermore, as I previously stated, I was never, or at least not technically, working alone during these overnight shifts. Despite working on the other side of the resort, my coworker Matthew was always assigned to the same shift. There was only a hallway separating the resort's 2 sizable sections. For days or weeks at a time, I would occasionally not even see Matthew. Therefore, even though I wasn't, I felt as though I was spending most evenings working alone. However, the evening had begun as usual. After clocking in, I began tidying the main floor. Even though it wasn't the hardest work, there was undoubtedly a lot to do because the place gets really messy during the busy season. The first hour passed rather quickly. I heard what sounded like someone tapping on a window while I was still in the spacious main room. I put my belongings down and moved to the front, where the majority of the windows were located. It wasn't until I approached one of the windows that I noticed anything. Footprints in the snow directly beneath it. They approached the glass directly before turning to face the opposite side of the structure. I put on my coat and went outside to take a look around, because I wasn't sure what to think about it. I had to tell them to go if it wasn't someone who was lost. However, as soon as I stepped outside, I noticed footprints moving from the window to the already plowed parking lot. I had no idea where they went after that. It was quite strange, but it was far too dark and cold to walk around the entire perimeter. I returned inside. I immediately returned to my work, hoping that the person in question wouldn't surface again. I'd like to say that 30 minutes have gone by. The tracks outside had probably been obscured by the snow by that point, so it was no longer worth my time to even consider it. That is, until I heard some doors open near the resort's connecting hallway, and Matthew arrived a short while later. When he saw me, he appeared upset and somewhat perplexed. He asked me what I was doing right away. I said I was working, after looking around in confusion. Matthew acknowledged it by nodding his head, but it seemed as though he didn't understand the response. "Is everything all right?" He shook his head and said, "Yeah, that he must have been tired or something." I told him that I had noticed some footprints in the snow outside and asked if they belonged to him before he departed. "No," he shook his head. Now that I had told him about the strange thing I had seen, I hoped he would elaborate on why he was so worried. Based on his behavior, I assumed that something strange had also happened to him. However, he remained silent. He simply moved to the opposite side of the resort after leaving my area. To be clear, Matthew and I weren't close friends or anything. Once more, we were merely acquaintances because we hardly ever saw one another. Therefore, our conversations were always limited to work-related topics. I'm bringing this up to explain why I didn't ask him a few more questions or approach him to truly try to understand what was going on. I continued working, but I thought about how weird this night was for the better part of the next hour. I heard a loud bang coming from the hallway between the resorts, just as I thought the remainder of the night would pass without any more incidents. It sounded like a heavy object striking a wall, or a door slamming. It was sufficient to cause me to leap and check on Matthew. I didn't see anything when I went to the connecting corridor. I went into the other area where Matthew was supposed to be, but he wasn't. "Are you okay, Matthew?" I repeatedly called his name, but I received no response at all. I became anxious, and when I reached the rear of that section, the rear door was wide open, and I felt sick to my stomach. The door appeared to have been open for only a few minutes, despite the snow blowing in. I rushed over and peered out. There were more footprints heading up the resort, toward the ski lifts and away from the building, but I didn't see anyone. This only increased my anxiety, because there was no reason Matthew should have been out there. I yelled Matthew's name once more, but my voice was muffled by the wind. I became quite concerned. I looked all over the building again for him, but I found nothing. The footprints in the snow were my only clue. I hurried to the open door after running back to my section and retrieving my coat. I went outside and began to track the footprints. They went much farther than I had anticipated. Additionally, there was nothing but wind and snow outside. There are no other indications that anyone is out there. I followed the footprints all the way to the bottom of the ski lifts, and a little way up I stopped at a shallow hill. They led into the trees lining the hill and out of the resort area. Nothing was out there, not even lights. And beyond that tree line, as far as I knew, it was just an ordinary mountain forest. My heart began to beat a little faster, and I had a suspicion that I might not have been following Matthew's footprints. "Are you out there, Matthew?" After a few long moments of silence, I noticed a figure moving into view and staring directly at me from behind all the trees in the far back. From what little I could see, it didn't appear to be similar to Matthew. I sprinted back down the hill and into the resort as quickly as I could, falling several times because my boots became trapped in the deep snow. I knew that whoever was out there was observing me, even though they didn't follow. After shutting the door, I dashed to the front desk and used that phone to dial the police. I had no idea what was going on, but I wasn't going to take any more chances by searching alone. Police were, of course, about 30 minutes away, because we were in the mountains. I spent the entire time hiding in the closet with all of the rental equipment, listening to the winds outside and the eerie quiet of the deserted resort. After waiting for about 10 minutes, I heard what sounded like a door opening on the opposite side of the resort, but I wasn't brave enough to check. After that, I heard nothing until the police arrived. They discovered another set of footprints heading back up to the back door, which was unsettling. So whoever was out there had returned, possibly in search of me. Additionally, it took the police just 30 minutes to formally declare Matthew missing. However, according to the police officers I spoke with, they found no evidence of foul play within the resort, leading the officers to believe that someone he knew had either led Matthew out or persuaded him to let him in. In any case, there was no way to follow the footprints once they reached the woods. I'm fairly certain that I was a suspect for a while because I was among, if not the last, people to see him. Eventually, though, they were able to verify that I had nothing to do with it. The entire situation was extremely frightening, and I can't help but feel partially responsible for how things turned out. I feel like I ought to have done more in some way. However, I am also aware that if I might be missing right now if I had gone farther into the forest to follow the footprints or had stopped trying to assist. It was around the holidays 4 years ago. To give my parents a Christmas surprise, I drove all the way to their small Montana town. Before returning home, I spent a full week there. I never considered the 16-hour drive to be too long. Pulling over at rest stops and napping for a few hours if necessary didn't bother me at all, and I always believed it was more worthwhile as opposed to making a hotel or motel stop, primarily because it would lengthen the journey. In any case, a large winter storm was reportedly on its way, so I departed in the afternoon, a few hours ahead of schedule. I therefore thought that if I left early, I would be able to pass before it began. I believe the storm struck about 4 or 5 hours in. In a matter of minutes, the road went from being largely deserted and uneventful to having snow all over it. In addition to pushing my car around and hurling snow at my windshield, the wind was extremely strong. I didn't think I was losing control or anything. I felt safe driving even though there were no other vehicles on the road. But after an hour, I became extremely exhausted from this. The snow began to accumulate on the road a little more as a result of having to pay close attention to the road. Suddenly, a winter storm advisory beeped on my phone, and I lost all service just a few minutes later. It was undoubtedly much worse than what I was now comfortable with. In particular, if something were to occur, I would be stranded with no ability to make a help call. I stopped a few miles down the road at the closest rest area. Situated in the trees off the highway, it was a quiet, deserted rest area, with a service building and a small parking lot covered in snow. On the opposite side of the lot, there was just one other vehicle parked. However, the roof had a thick layer of snow covering it, giving the impression that it had existed prior to the storm. The storm somehow got worse a few minutes after we pulled in. A whiteout occurred. The other car was no longer even visible to me. In fact, the wind was quite frightening. In this kind of weather, I don't think anyone could have been driving. I waited in the snowstorm for a long, dull hour. I eventually made the decision to leave and go inside the rest stop service building to use the restroom because I was bored and uncomfortable. The icy wind and snow were excruciating as soon as I stepped outside. I ran to the building and entered. There was only a tiny lobby with 2 doors to the restrooms, a few benches, and some road map pamphlets. Fortunately, the heat seemed to be working there, so I spent a minute warming up in the lobby while observing the snow falling outside the windows. Now that the snow had completely covered the windshield, I could only just make out the car that was still parked over there. I found it odd that it didn't appear to be on. They would have frozen by now if the heat hadn't been on, because it was below 0 degrees outside. However, a minute later, I went to the bathroom door and attempted to push it open. It briefly opened before slamming shut. It hardly moved when I pushed it once more. I retreated a step. The door wasn't locked. I couldn't open it because it seemed like someone was on the other side. For a moment, I was just stunned and unsure of what to think as I gazed at the door. It was quite peculiar. I considered simply using the women's restroom instead, figuring that it shouldn't matter if the person using the men's restroom was the only other vehicle at the rest stop. But to be honest, I didn't feel secure there at all. I had the impression that there must be a reason why they were obstructing the door in this manner, or that something wasn't quite right. Furthermore, I truly didn't want to try too hard. I quickly left the building again. I heard the bathroom door swing open as I was leaving, but I didn't look back. I simply kept walking through the storm before getting back into my car. The entire rest stop parking lot was covered in snow by this stage of the storm, and I wasn't sure if I could even get out. I desired to. I didn't want to get stuck trying to get away, even if it meant driving a few miles down to a different location to pull off. I tried to wait out the storm while I sat there. I made an effort to come up with any plausible explanation for why someone would block the door in that manner. But to be honest, I was at a loss. Nothing that would account for their awareness of my arrival, and standing at the door to prevent me from going inside. A few minutes later, I saw a shape begin to emerge from the whiteouts between the building and my car. It was an individual. He essentially stopped moving and just stood in the blizzard as soon as he became visible. He was facing me and appeared to be on the phone with someone, but I couldn't tell if he was staring at me. After pacing around the same area for a minute, while continuing to speak on the phone, he began to gradually approach my car. It seemed as though he would pace a few steps in my direction before remaining motionless for a while in an attempt to blend in. However, there was a moment when he was much closer, and I could see him looking straight at me in the car. Suddenly, he began to approach my window while grinning broadly and exaggeratedly. He approached my car directly, tapped on the window, and smiled at me through the glass. I was really scared, and, as embarrassing as it is to admit, I was utterly terrified. For a brief period, I was unable to motivate myself to take any action. The man began to tap on the window more forcefully. I basically hit it so hard that I was shocked it didn't break. I then noticed another man emerge from the rest stop building and begin to run over in the distance behind him. I woke up and shifted my car into reverse. When my tires began to spin out, my heart fell. I was not moving at all. The man drew nearer and nearer until my car abruptly jerked back and gained traction. I put it in drive after backing out. The man who had just arrived threw a knife directly at the windshield in the brief moment before I drove away. Although it bounced off, it left an enormous fissure in the center. I prayed that I wouldn't lose control or become stuck as I drove away. As far as I know, they didn't try to follow me, even though I was certain they would. Until the storm began to pass and I had service, I drove recklessly through it. However, it had been so long that when the police arrived, neither of the men were there. However, they did discover the vehicle. It remained undisturbed in the center of the parking lot. It wasn't either of the men's cars, despite what I had thought. It was owned by... I didn't recognize this other guy when the police showed me a reference photo. The man's disappearance was discovered over the course of the following few days. He was nowhere to be found. According to what I've heard, he was traveling by car as well. His family thinks he pulled off the road to spend the night, but he was never seen or heard from again. To be honest, I believe that something horrible occurred at that rest stop right before I got there. When I entered, I believe one of the men was outside keeping watch while on call with the other, telling him to block the door. I have a terrible feeling about what I might have discovered if I had pushed my way inside. Additionally, they most likely wouldn't have permit me to leave as well.